Welcome to Torah Apologetic. And Shalom Aleichem. In this video about the brief history of Jewish cleansing in Muslim countries, it is given by the wonderful brother Oren, from Israel. So, those interested please watch the whole video, and at the end of the video please go to the below description of this video. And subscribe to his channel, besides obviously Torah Apologetic. Please also like and share this video. So now, enjoy the video.
I guess you have never heard about the Farhud, the 1941 pogrom against Jews in Iraq, in which hundreds of Jews were killed. I guess you have never heard the story about Sol Hajoel, a Moroccan Jewish girl, only 17 years old, who was killed for refusing to convert to Islam. I guess you have never heard about the anti-Jewish riots in Aden, Yemen. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the picture. You probably know nothing or next to nothing about this topic, the ethnic cleansing of Jews within Muslim countries. There is this false narrative that, unlike in Europe, Jews enjoyed the same rights as Muslims in Muslim countries, and that until the rise of Zionism, Jews were able to lead peaceful, happy lives in Muslim countries. That is a lie. I mean, it was better for Jews in Muslim countries than in occupied Poland in 1943, but that isn't exactly setting the bar high. The Jews were never seen as equal to Muslims in Muslim countries, not before colonial times and not after, not before the rise of Zionism and not after, not before the State of Israel was established and definitely not after. Was it all horrible? No, and I will get to that shortly. Some of you are not going to like what I'm about to say and will probably accuse me of Zionist propaganda. So I would like to start off with two comments. First of all, let's look at the numbers of Jews in Muslim countries. In the 1940s in Libya, there were 35,000 Jews, and today there are 0. In Egypt, there were 85,000, and today there are 3. In Tunisia, there were 100,000. Today there are 1,500. I could move on to Syria, Lebanon, and Iran, but again, you get the picture. All of these Jewish communities have been completely destroyed or almost completely destroyed. And when the numbers are so dramatic as this, it does tell us something. It's not something that should just be ignored. Communities don't just disappear if they are having a great time. In non-Muslim countries, like the US, France, and Canada, there were Zionist and Zionist activity, and a large part of these communities stayed. Immigration is hard. You only resort to it when the situation is unbearable or when you think that it will soon become unbearable. And my second comment, if you are not convinced by the numbers of Jews I just mentioned, then tell me this. Can you name one minority in any Muslim country that is thriving? From Morocco in the west to Iran in the east, from Turkey in the north to Yemen in the south, the number of Coptic Christians in Egypt is decreasing. Christians in Iraq are disappearing, with 2 million having left in recent years. Iran is the home to many oppressed groups that no one cares about, the Baha'i, the Ratostras, the Balak people. I know you have probably never heard of them. Independent women aren't having a good time in Iran either. Then there are the Kurds, a Muslim nation who are fighting for independence but being oppressed by other Muslims. No one is getting out onto the streets for them, by the way. And there are Hindus who are suffering terribly in all Muslim countries. There used to be millions of Hindus in Muslim countries. They are disappearing. They get 0 media coverage. I will soon be making a video about the real oppressed people in the Middle East. But now, back to the main topic of this video, the ethnic cleansing of the Jews within Muslim countries. I will start off with the community that suffered the most, the Jews of Yemen. Unlike other Jewish communities, which also enjoyed time of prosperity, Yemenite Jews experienced hardships that was either very bad or catastrophic. They had suffered under Muslim rule for hundreds of years and been exposed to a series of anti-Jewish laws, one of which was that orphan children had to be Muslimized. This was one of the reasons why the Jews of Yemen got engaged and married at a very young age, so that if the parents died, the kid would already be part of another family. This fact also explains why half of the Yemenite Jews had already migrated to Israel before 1948, before the creation of Israel. One of the waves of immigration of Yemenite Jews to Israel took place in 1882, the same year that the first wave of Jews came from Europe in modern times. As an Israeli, I've been accused of colonialism about 400,000 times. Never mind the fact that there has never been a Jewish colonial empire in Europe like that of the British or the French, but most of the Jews in Israel today, and indeed 150 years ago, came from Muslim countries. This shows how wrong, how weak and distorted the argument accusing Israel of colonialism is. When a poor Russian Jew who survived the pogroms comes to Israel, he is a symbol of white colonialism, and when Jews migrate from Yemen in the same year for the same reason, they are completely ignored. In 1947, there were pogroms against Jews in Aden. About 100 Jews were killed, and nobody was held accountable. A year later, 2 Muslim girls drowned in a well in Yemen, and the Jews were blamed. They were arrested and ordered to pay substantial fines. They lived in constant fear and suffered immensely. From 1949 to 1950, all of the Yemenite Jews, about 50,000 people, migrated to Israel. Airplanes were my first love before I found out about girls, and there is a nice little anecdote I like to tell here. Most of the Jews of Yemen, many of whom have never ever seen a car before, were flown to Israel in airplanes. By the way, which company flew the Jews from Yemen to Israel? Air Alaska. I know. Golda Meir wrote in her memoir, "Sometimes I drove to the airport to meet the Jews as they landed from Yemen. Once I asked an elderly man, 'Have you ever seen an airplane in your life?' And he said, 'No.' And then I asked, 'Weren't you afraid to fly?' And he said, 'No. As it says in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, you yourself have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.' Today, there are no Jews in Yemen. The Jews in Iran have a very long history going back 2,500 years. Although today Iran is the main root of evil in the Middle East, I must say that of the supporters I have in Muslim countries, most of them are from Iran. I hope that the good people of Iran will bring down the cruel Islamic regime. I'm not going to try to summarize the history of Jews in Iran, but there is one short story about the Jews of the city of Mashhad. In 1839, many years before the advent of the Zionist movement, there was a blood libel against the Jews. 30 Jews were killed and a few girls were abducted to become Muslim child brides. The community was forced to convert to Islam. For more than 100 years, the Jews kept their identity a secret. They were known in Mashhad as the new Muslims and continued to suffer at the hands of their Muslim neighbors. The converted Jews had to open their shops on Saturday to prove that they didn't observe the Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest. So despite opening the doors of their shop, they did their best not to sell anything to the customers. After the Islamic Revolution of 1979, they all fled to Israel. There are no more Jews in Mashhad. From Iran, let's move to the country next door, Iraq. I started this video by talking about the Farhud, and the thumbnail of this video is also taken from the Farhud program. I'm focusing on it for 2 reasons. The Farhud was the largest pogroms against the Jews in terms of the number of deaths. Terrible things were done to the Jews, and many women were the R word. I have to just stop here and say a word about this, about what's going on. You are not just watching my video, you are watching my video on YouTube. Now, I love YouTube and I love the Americans, but I really need to choose my words very carefully. I have to comply with the YouTube community guidelines, which are basically the YouTube rules. YouTube, stop calling them community guidelines. They have nothing to do with my community, with my subscribers, and they are not guidelines. They are strictly imposed American corporate, Puritan, politically correct rules. If I don't comply with them, YouTube reduces the exposure of this video by about 90%. It has happened to me a number of times in the last few weeks. That is why I'm not saying the word I really want to say, which is what happened. So the R word stands for making love, but without the love and the consent part, which is actually just pure evil and violence. So hundreds of Jewish women were subjected to the R word. The reason I chose this specific photo is that it doesn't show 1 or 10 or even 100 Arabs. You can see hundreds of Arabs armed with knives and cheering on their way to kill Jews. The Arab women were cheering too. There has never been any incident involving gangs of Jews or Israelis storming into an Arab village population and killing Arab children and subjecting Arab women to the R word. Never. Even after the Yom Kippur War or the suicide bombers, never has the Jewish mob done anything like it. Never. The Muslims, on the other hand, have done it, and they are still doing it to Jews and other minorities. In Hebrew, we refer to the Jewish community in Iraq as the Babylonian Jews, as the Jews in Iraq were there from the times of the great empires of the East, more than 1,000 years before the establishment of Islam. So there were 150,000 Babylonian Jews 80 years ago. Today there are about 4 Jews left in Baghdad. Now let's say a word about the largest Jewish diaspora in the Muslim world, the Jews of Morocco. My family originally came from Morocco. Just kidding, my family, like all Jewish family, originally come from Judea. The Jews are from Judea. Easy. If you speak to Jews from Morocco, many of them will have a few good things to say about their lives there. Lots of them will tell you that they used to be rich, and every other Moroccan Jew will tell you that their grandfather and the king were friends. When you hear their stories, you have to wonder if the Moroccan king spent all his time just taking selfies with Jews from 1940 till 1950. But seriously, I'm here talking about the other side, about the pogroms and the discrimination. So who is right? The Jews telling stories about how rich they were, or me? There are a few possible answers to this question, but the simple and truthful answer is we are both right. Jews can be successful despite being persecuted and discriminated against. They can still cherish some nice personal memories. There are plenty of examples of this, but let's go with the most obvious one. The Jews in Germany. They saw themselves as German. They contributed to society more than any other group, yet they were persecuted, and we all know how things ended. And many German Jews who migrate to Israel still had happy memories and missed a lot of things about their former lives. The second answer, and it is one that many Israelis are not going to like, is that Israelis, whether their grandparents came from Morocco or Syria or Poland, don't know their personal family history. Maybe you can name 3 or 4 different ethnic foods and you have heard a few stories from your grandparents, but that doesn't mean you actually know your history. There are many stories that your parents and grandparents didn't tell you because they wanted to protect you, the same way you want to protect your children and moderate the information you give them. The third answer has more to do with the nature of history itself. Personal memories may be part of history, but they often contradict it. As a tour guide, I often stand at a meeting point where history meets personal and collective memories. Personal memory is a living thing. It changes with time, it changes with collective memory, and it changes with personal experience. And if you go through a traumatic experience, like immigrating at the age of 6 or 13 or 17, leaving a place where you knew the people and the language and the culture and moved to Israel, a poor country recovering from a war where you need to sleep in a tent for years and you don't understand the culture and the language, all of this will affect the way in which you remember your past. Immigration is a traumatic experience, and let me remind you that I'm talking about the 1950s, before having feelings was invented. The fact that in the 1940s there were 220,000 Jews in Morocco and today there are 2,000 does not suggest that they were having such a great time there. There were pogroms against Jews in Taza in 1903, in Casablanca in 1907, in Setat in 1907, the Tritel, the Fez riots of 1912. Each pogrom saw dozens of Jews killed, women subjected to the R word, girls kidnapped, synagogue burned to the ground, and private Jewish property plundered. In each instance, it wasn't just one crazy guy that did it. Thousands of Moroccan Muslims were active in the anti-Jewish pogroms. The Jews in Morocco, like all the Jews in all Muslim countries, had to pay the jizya. This is a tax paid by non-Muslim subjects, Jews and Christians who are living in an Islamic state. Many more rules were imposed in a bid to humiliate the Jews. From the 15th century on, Jews had to live in Jewish ghettos called El Malech, and they were not allowed to go out at night. In 1834, Sol Hajuel, a 17-year-old Jewish girl, was publicly executed in the city of Fez after her neighbors falsely claimed she had converted to Islam. When Sol said she was still Jewish, she was accused of apostasy, of converting to Islam and then denouncing it. In Muslim countries, you were not allowed to convert from Islam to other religions. She was offered money and a good life if she would live as a Muslim girl, but she insisted on remaining Jewish. She said that she was born a Jew and she would die as a Jew. Because of YouTube community guidelines, I can't go into the whole story, but I will leave some interesting links below the video. I said at the start that Jews from Yemen came to the land of Israel in 1882. If you know the history of Tel Aviv, you will know that the founders, the first families that bought up land north of Jaffa, were Jewish families from North Africa, Shlush, Amzaleg, Abulafia, and that all happened 30 years before the Zionist Congress. There is so much to say about this topic, but we don't really have enough time to go into it all here. The main goal of this video was to talk about the real ethnic cleansing that was going on in the 1940s, the one carried out by the Muslims against the Jews, the one that no one talks about. Huge communities were wiped out by means of pogroms, riots, and a lot of brutality. Unlike the Palestinians who started a war against the Jews and lost, the Jews living in Muslim countries never used violence against their Muslim neighbors. The second objective of this video is to raise awareness, mainly among Jews, to learn about the history of the Jewish communities. Most Israelis know next to nothing about this. In Jerusalem, there is the Center of Moroccan History. In Or Yehuda, there is the Center for Babylonian Judaism. In Rehovot, there is the House of Yemenite Jewish Heritage Center. And I also urge you to do something even more important than visiting a heritage museum. Go and visit your parents or grandparents, if you are lucky enough to still have them around, and ask them to tell you their story. Ask them to tell you everything, and write it all down, and do it now. You are not busy, you are watching YouTube videos. Tomorrow might be too late.